Good afternoon. Welcome back to UCSF Department of Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm Bob Wachter, Chair of the Department of Medicine. Let's start with a couple of quick announcements. Next slide, please. So here's the ground rules. I think you know them by now. The recording will be up tonight and be on YouTube. Put your screen in full screen mode. If you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and my colleague Lakshmi Santosh is monitoring those. We'll try to do as many as we can, and closed captioning is available to you if you would like. Next slide, please. One bit of advertising. We're doing a one-day COVID update, focusing a lot on clinical aspects, but more broadly, and you see I'm co-chairing it with four spectacular members of our faculty. It's coming up on November 12th, and the address is there. If you search on COVID CME UCSF, you'll find it as well. So anyone who wants more COVID info, I encourage you to attend that. Let's go out of the slides. And one more advanced announcement is next week we're going to be off for Veterans Day for Grand Rounds. We'll be back on November 18th. For a special Grand Rounds, it'll be a fireside chat. I'll be talking to Mark Larrett, who will be stepping down as head of UCSF Health, a job he's had for now over 2 decades, talking about his career and the evolution of healthcare and academic medicine in UCSF over the last couple of decades. I think it'll be really interesting. So this week is another COVID session as we hit the grim milestone in the United States of 750,000 deaths in the United States. That is larger than the population of Seattle, while also celebrating the approval of vaccines for kids. The pandemic has improved quite a bit in the US, but may be plateauing a bit, and there are some darkish clouds on the horizon, as well as some not yet out of the woods signals that we see from the UK and Singapore and a few other places. So a lot going on with vaccines, a lot going on with the state of the pandemic, and I've brought 2 of my favorite experts to talk about both of those things. They are extraordinary educators, have educated not only us, but many people around the country and the world for the last nearly 2 years. The first is Paul Offit. Paul will come on in a sec. Paul is one of the foremost experts on vaccines in the United States. He's professor of vaccinology at the University of Pennsylvania and professor of pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Philly, where he directs the Vaccine Education Center. As you probably know, he's a member of the Advisory Committee on Vaccines for the FDA, so he has been smack in the middle of all of the debates on vaccines for the last year, but he's been doing vaccines for his entire career. He's co-inventor of a rotavirus vaccine. He's founding advisory board member of the Autism Science Foundation and the Foundation for Vaccine Research, as well as a member of the Institute of Medicine and co-editor of the foremost vaccine textbook, which is called appropriately Vaccines. So Paul, if you could turn your camera on, that would be great. We're going to start with a short talk, and if you've been watching any TV in the last year, Paul's background is completely familiar to you. We're going to start with Paul, who will go for about 40 minutes total, I think about a 30-minute talk, and then we'll have some time for discussion, and then we'll bring on George Rutherford to talk about the state of the pandemic. But let me turn it over to Paul.
Okay, so I'm going to start just by talking about kind of what's going on regarding getting on top of this pandemic, which will require immunity, either immunity induced by vaccination or immunity induced by natural infection. So regarding vaccination, this you all know, that you are far less likely to be infected independent of your age or to be hospitalized or to die if you were vaccinated as compared to if you're unvaccinated. Oops, I keep slipping the slide. Okay, this is a just a point to make that that protection against hospitalization, for the most part, is mediated by immunological memory cells, memory B cells, and those are generally long-lived. And it certainly looks like protection induced by vaccination induces high frequencies of memory B cells, and that's why protection against serious disease has held up for the time, at least since this vaccine has been out, which is what I just said there. And this just is a study that was done out of John Weary's lab, where what he did was he looked at the frequency of memory B cells, sort of in the blue man group there on the left, in terms of being able to identify them. You see if in this center part of this slide, just that memory B cells are long-lived. That is consistent with the fact that protection against serious illness is also apparently long-lived. And then there's the immunity induced by disease. This slide, just what you see on CNN or MSNBC all the time, that there's about 47, 48 million cases, although those are just the number of people who've been tested and found to be infected. The frequency is actually much higher than that. This was a study that was done sort of soon after the vaccine, after this disease came into this country, looking at 52,000 healthcare workers in the Cleveland Clinic health system between December 2020 and May 2021. So it's about 1,400 workers. And what they found was that that there was no disease in those who were previously infected and unvaccinated. It's an early study showing that natural infection appeared to protect against disease. And then this was just a review in Nature Review Immunology. Looking again, if you look at the right-hand side of this, it's just a collection of a number of studies looking at people who were naturally infected, again, to show that memory B cells appear to be induced by natural infection and appear to be fairly long-lived. So if the goal is protection against serious illness, meaning protection against disease that causes you to seek medical care or be hospitalized or go to the ICU, both natural infection and immunization appear to be fairly good at doing that. Okay, then in terms of combining the two, as of October 31st, 2021, about 420 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered. About 58% of the population was fully vaccinated. 60% had at least received one dose of an mRNA-containing vaccine. And also from sero-epidemiological studies, at least 100 million people have been naturally infected. And I think that's actually a low number. Obviously, there's overlap between these two groups. There's those who've been infected and vaccinated and vice versa. But if you combine the immunity induced by disease with that induced by immunization, I think at least 80% of the US population has been at least is protected against severe disease. And that's consistent with this serological study that was done looking at like 1.5 million blood donor units to look at the presence of antibodies directed against this virus, and found again sort of more than 80%. I think there's a couple of limitations of this study. First of all, it was concluded in May 2021, so this was a while ago. And two, you have to ask to what extent you're getting selection bias. What kind of person chooses to give their blood may be more likely to be immunized. But I think we're at least at 80% population immunity against severe illness. So is that enough? I mean, what percentage of the population needs to be immune to induce herd immunity? There's actually a formula for this. It depends on sort of two factors. The first is the R0, or contagiousness index. The CDC currently estimates that the R0 for the Delta variant is between 5 and 9, which is high, really approaching kind of chickenpox transmissibility. And the other factor is effectiveness of the vaccine. Obviously, the more contagious the virus is, the greater percentage of the population needs to be immunized. The less effective that a vaccine is, then the greater percentage that needs to be immunized. So that in the Plotkin's vaccines, now the book formerly called Vaccines, now called Plotkin's Vaccines, there's a chapter in it called Community Immunity, where they go through how this particular formula was derived, but it's R0 minus 1 over R0 divided by the effectiveness of a vaccine. So sort of giving us our best case scenario, if you assume an R0 of 5 and a vaccine effectiveness of 90%, 5 minus 1 over 5 is 0.8, divided by 0.9 is about 0.9. So it should say currently, I think, at about 80%, but I think we still probably need to vaccinate about 40 million more people, which is not going to be easy. Okay, there are three obstacles to herd immunity. I think the first is variants. The ancestral strain that raised its head in Wuhan was ultimately replaced by the first variant, the D614G variant, which never had a designated Greek letter. That's the one that swept across Asia, Europe, the US, killed a couple 100,000 people here. That was then, for the most part, replaced by the Alpha variant, which has been replaced by the Delta variant, because the goal of this virus, from the virus's standpoint, is to become more and more contagious. And the Delta variant is quite contagious. Frankly, it's hard to imagine a virus that's going to be more contagious than that, but we'll see. And this is just a somewhat older slide. Here it shows the Delta variant at about 94%. Actually, it's closer to 98% at this point. Oops. Okay, so obstacle number 2 is misinformation. Honey, come look, I found some information all the world's top scientists and doctors miss. This is the scourge of social media. Okay, so let's go through just some of the misconceptions about this vaccine. The first is that COVID-19 vaccines aren't necessary for children. This has certainly come up now with our approval, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee approval, now CDC recommendation for vaccines now for the 5 to 11-year-olds. So vaccines now are recommended for anyone over 5 years of age. The incidence of disease in young children is increasing. It's been between 150,000 to 200, as many as 250,000 over the last month or so. And if you look at the percentage of child cases when the virus first came into the country as compared to now, it's gone from about 3% to more than 25%. Obviously, there's some difference in terms of who gets tested, but clearly this is a childhood illness. This was a study that was done very early in April 2021, looking at adolescents that were admitted to the hospital with COVID. And what they found in these 200 adolescents is that nearly a third of those required ICU admission, 5% required mechanical ventilation. About a third of these kids had no previous comorbidities that would have put them at high risk of serious illness. And then there's MIS-C, this multisystem inflammatory disease, which is primarily a disease of the 5 to 13-year-old with a sort of peak at around 9 years of age. So making that 5 to 11-year age group all the more important. And you can see here there's about 5,200 cases as well as deaths. Just make sure. Oh, right, sorry. And then one other thing, I think no group has suffered the social isolation of this virus more than children. Okay, this is the concern that never seems to die, even though it's completely unfounded, that vaccines decrease fertility. This fear was born when two researchers petitioned the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, which is the European equivalent of the FDA, to withdraw approval for COVID-19 vaccines, claiming that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein was genetically similar to syncytin-1, which is a protein on placental cells important for placental health. First of all, that's not true. It's like saying you and I have the same social security number because they both contain the number 5. And so these two proteins are immunologically distinct. In any case, there were 36 women who became pregnant during the phase 3 trials of the mRNA vaccines. If it was true that an immune response to this vaccine was decreasing fertility, then there should have been more instances of pregnancy in the placebo group, but there weren't. It was equally divided, suggesting that the vaccine neither enhanced nor negatively affected fertility. And also, if you're arguing that making an immune response to the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is also making an immune response to a key protein in your placenta, more than 100 million people have been infected with this virus over the last year and a half here. So what's happened to the birth rate? And the answer is the birth rate's pretty much stayed about the same. So all the evidence is that this doesn't affect fertility, but I have had parents of 5 to 11-year-olds email me and say they're afraid of this for their young child. Okay, the next is that COVID-19 vaccines alter DNA. I mean, it's a genetic vaccine. It's really the first of the genetic vaccines. Both the mRNA vaccines and the vectored virus vaccines are genetic vaccines. And the minute you say that word genetic, you can see where people would sort of recoil thinking this is going to alter their DNA. So if you use the mRNA vaccines as an example, the lipid nanoparticle encapsulated piece of mRNA enters your cytoplasm, where it joins roughly 200,000 other pieces of messenger RNA, all designed to make proteins and enzymes necessary for us to live. It does that for a few days and then stops, and then so it's an utterly natural process. So the question is, can it alter your DNA? Well, the DNA is in the nucleus. So in order for the mRNA to get into the nucleus, we require a nuclear access signal, which it doesn't have. Even if it did enter the nucleus, it's RNA, it's not DNA. So it would have to be reverse transcribed to DNA, which requires the enzyme reverse transcriptase, which it also doesn't have. Even if it were reverse transcribed to DNA, it still has to be integrated into DNA, which requires the enzyme integrase, which it also doesn't have. So the chances really that mRNA in any way is going to alter your DNA is not just small, it's zero. Frankly, you have a greater chance of becoming Spider-Man after getting this vaccine. That's why I never understand really why people always think that if you're getting your DNA altered, it's going to alter it for the worst. I mean, why can't you develop superpowers? But in any case, just because we never like to leave the science at the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital, Philadelphia, you become Spider-Man when you're bitten by a radioactive spider. Okay, next, that the COVID-19 vaccine shouldn't be given during pregnancy. It's interesting the way this whole story is played out. Initially, when vaccines are tested, if they're not tested in pregnant women, and for the most part, these vaccines weren't, at least during the phase 3 trials, then what the CDC will do is they'll say contraindicated for use in pregnancy. They didn't do that here. When the vaccine was released in December, the mRNA vaccines, the CDC said that a pregnant woman could reasonably choose to get a vaccine. It wasn't a recommendation, but it was a could reasonably choose to do that. And the reason they said that was that if you compare women who are pregnant with those of the same age who aren't pregnant, you find that pregnant women are 3 times more likely to require ICU care if infected with this virus, 2 to 3 times more likely to require intubation, mechanical ventilation, or ECMO support, and 1.5 times more likely to die. So what happened was then thousands and then tens of thousands of pregnant women did choose to get the vaccine, which then through the VSafe system allowed researchers to look. Do I have that pic? Oh, let me just see. Do I have that slide? Yeah, researchers like Tim Shimabukuro at the CDC to look at pregnant women who received the vaccine, compare them to pregnant women who didn't receive the vaccine to see whether there was any difference in outcome either in the pregnancy or the birth. And what they found was that looking at a couple pregnancy outcomes, pregnancy complications, and then neonatal outcomes, they found no differences between the vaccinated and unvaccinated group. And then what's happened with this publication, the CDC then changed to that this vaccine was recommended for use in pregnancy. And over the last couple of weeks, because of an increased incidence of pregnant women who have been hospitalized and either died with this virus or delivered their babies severely prematurely, they have changed that recommendation to that the vaccine is urgently recommended for use in pregnant women. Okay, next is that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is a toxin. This is sort of all over the internet. I mean, I'm just picking on Dr. Brittle because it was easy to find his quote, but there are many people who put this notion out there. Brittle said, quote, terrifying new research finds vaccine spike protein unexpectedly in the bloodstream. It's actually not that unexpected. The protein is linked to blood clots, heart, and brain damage. So it was hard for me initially to find where this all came from, but many of those who make this statement tend to reference this paper out of Circulation Research, which was a study of mice that were inoculated intratracheally with about 500 million plaque-forming units of the pseudovirus, of the vesicular stomatitis virus, which is a rhabdovirus in the same class as rabies, expressing the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. And they found that when they did that there were damage to several organs. So, I mean, what do you learn from this kind of paper? Nothing, unless that you learn that we shouldn't inoculate people intratracheally with 500 million plaque-forming units of vesicular stomatitis virus, into which is cloned the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein gene. When you do experiments in experimental animals, and in our work with rotavirus, I spend a lot of time inoculating experimental animals with what were putative vaccines. You try and mimic the human situation as closely as you can, knowing that often experimental animals are not predictive of events in man. I mean, look at SV40 virus, which was found to be a cause of cancer in animals, but was never found to be a cause of cancer in man. Or some of the saccharine studies. It's as David Wachter, who is a researcher at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia, famously says, mice lie and monkeys exaggerate. Frankly, if mice were predictive of man, we'd have had an AIDS vaccine about 30 years ago. Okay, next, according to VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, COVID-19 vaccines kill people. Here's Tucker Carlson on Fox News in May of 2021 saying, quote, 3,362 people apparently died after getting the COVID vaccine. More people, according to VAERS, have died after getting the shot than from all other vaccines. So VAERS is a passive reporting system. Anybody can report to VAERS. It's really misnamed. I think when people see Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, they assume that what's reported there are vaccine adverse events. But really what it is it's just events that have occurred in temporal association with getting a vaccine, which often are in no sense associated with a causal association. That's the problem with VAERS. The nice way to say it is it's a very noisy system. And anybody can report. You can report that your child got a vaccine and turned into the Incredible Hulk, and that will end up in the system. There's no screening out of obviously bogus claims. So is this true? Is Tucker Carlson right? So let's take a step back. There are about 750 deaths in the US per 100,000 people per year. Therefore, 2 people die per 100,000 per day. By May 6, 2021, when Tucker Carlson made his famous pronouncement, 110 million people in the US had been vaccinated. Therefore, 2,200 people would have been expected to die within 24 hours receiving the vaccine, and 4,400 within 48 hours, unless the vaccines confer immortality, which they don't. This is the problem with all vaccines. They only prevent vaccine preventable diseases. They don't prevent everything else that happens in life that's temporally associated with getting it. So the 3,300 deaths claimed by Carlson to have been caused by the vaccines are exactly what one would have expected, assuming vaccines killed nobody. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, but early on, Hank Aaron received the vaccine. 2 weeks later, died of a stroke. He was in his mid-80s. Men die of strokes in their mid-80s, but the media did bring up the notion of whether the vaccine could have caused that. Okay, then this one, vaccinated teachers are dangerous to students. This is actually my favorite one. This came up again in the media when it was decided that not only teachers were dangerous to students, but other students were dangerous to students. So this comes from the Centner Academy in Florida, the ironically named Brain School. The headmaster of this school did not allow teachers into the classroom who'd been vaccinated because it was her belief that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein was toxic, and that if you'd been vaccinated, then you could excrete that protein, and that protein would then enter somebody else's body and hurt them. I mean, I only wish this were true. I mean, it would be great, right? You could have someone who's an insulin-dependent diabetic just standing next to somebody who's making normal insulin, and then they wouldn't have to, worry about injecting themselves. Or have a person with sickle cell disease just stand next to somebody who's making normal hemoglobin, and they wouldn't have to worry about all those vaso-occlusive crises and hospitalizations and blood transfusions. But sadly, it doesn't work that way. And then there's this sort of misinformation potpourri that was created by a movie called Plandemic, which was released on May 4th, 2020, and really launched many of the sort of conspiracy theories that have held up to the present time. So, for example, that hydroxychloroquine cures COVID-19, that SARS-CoV-2 was manipulated to create a pandemic strain, that the influenza vaccine increases your chance of getting COVID-19, that flu vaccine contains SARS-CoV-2, that microbes in the ocean cure COVID-19, thus was the cry to, open the beaches so we could get into the ocean and cure ourselves. That wearing a protective mask activates SARS-CoV-2. Louis Gohmert, a congressman from Texas, swore that the only reason he got COVID was because he wore a mask. That Bill Gates created SARS-CoV-2 pandemic so that he could make money selling vaccines to prevent it. Presumably not, $60 billion is not enough for him. And that COVID-19 death statistics have been manipulated to control the public. Many of these notions that were raised more than a year ago still survive. And I think the reason they survive is that we're drawn to conspiracy because conspiracy creates order out of chaos. I mean, a pandemic is chaos. We don't really have a clear understanding of where it started. We don't really have a clear understanding of exactly how it spread or how best to control spread. And it's really comforting to know that Bill Gates started it, or that a Wuhan lab manipulated it, that Tony Fauci's behind it, or NIH is behind it, the World Health Organization is behind it, and that really hydroxychloroquine's working, but they're hiding it from us, or ivermectin, or any of those things. It creates order out of chaos. We could argue the same thing for Andrew Wakefield and the MMR as a cause of autism. It's not clear what the cause or causes of autism are. It's not clear what a cure for autism is. But he offered that. He offered a cause. He offered a cure. Just don't get MMR vaccine. And that's very comforting. It's wrong, but it's very comforting. That's what you're up against. Whereas Neil deGrasse Tyson says you can't use logic and reason to convince someone out of an argument that they didn't use logic and reason to get into. Okay, finally, last few slides. The third obstacle is claims to personal freedoms. This really bugs me the most. Claiming bodily autonomy. Don't tell me what I can do with my body. If you step on a rusty nail and you go to the emergency department and you're offered a tetanus vaccine and you choose not to get it and you get tetanus, no one's going to catch tetanus from you. It's not a contagious disease. You're good. But that's not true here. This is a contagious virus. I mean, you're making a decision for those with whom you come in contact. That's not your right. As Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said, your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. But it's certainly not new. This was a smallpox pamphlet more than 100 years ago. But this notion of sort of personal liberty is not a new one. So what does personal liberty look like? It looks like this. In Springfield, Oregon, an unvaccinated employee infected 64 and killed 5 because of his decision. This was in August, his decision not to get a vaccine. Or this, which was reported by in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report by the CDC in Marin County, California, that an occasionally unmasked adult infected with Delta, working for 2 days in the classroom, unvaccinated, proceeded to infect 12 of the 24 children in her classroom. See the disadvantages of sitting in the front row. Okay, so I'll stop there, and thanks for your attention. That's the URL at our Vaccine Education Center at CHOP.
Great, thank you, Paul. Why don't you stop sharing? Perfect, and I should say that Paul has no disclosures. And for folks
who want to say that, I have nothing to disclose. Nothing. Okay, I'm good.
So that'll come up if folks are interested in CME, which will come up at the end. Yes, good. So we've got about 15 minutes, which is great. A whole lot of practical questions I want to get into, but start with the misinformation and the kind of what you've seen over the past year. You've been in this world for 30-ish years. You've lived with autism. You've, all that kind of stuff. In, March 2020, as you thought about how this is going to spool out, and you knew there would be a vaccine at some point, I don't know if you thought it would come so soon. Did you predict this level of misinformation? Did you think we'd be in this much of a pickle? Or, I assume you knew there would be some of this coming from all your experience with prior vaccines, but what about this has surprised you?
All of it. I would have never predicted this. I certainly know the anti-vaccine people are active, but if you listen to people like Barbara Fisher or Del Bigtree, they'll often say in their pre-pandemic days, give me a pandemic. This is what Del Bigtree recently said, like Ebola, he said. If Ebola swept through this country, then a vaccine makes sense. And the old joke is not a joke, is people used to say, because vaccines are a victim of their own success, that maybe what we need is just a good plague. Well, we've got one. And I thought that with vaccines, as our ticket out, the vaccines are clearly our ticket out. There couldn't be more compelling data that vaccines prevent you from being hospitalized or dying than the data that we've generated. Nonetheless, you have vaccines, you have these anti-vaccine activists that are incredibly successful at getting their information out there. The other difference, though, here is that I would have said prior to this pandemic that there was not a politics to the anti-vaccine movement. On the left, it was kind of, all things natural. Don't inject me with something unnatural. I'm going to, it's the sort of, as you well know, living in California, the sort of, bib overall, crunchy granola, gluten-free, BPA-free, dolphin-free crowd. That crowd. So that was the left. That was the argument.
Just describe my breakfast. Thank you.
And on the right, it was what you see, which is government off my back. The sort of Rand Paul libertarian, don't tell me what to do, and that was sort of your cultural identity. That is what now dominates is the politics of this. I think it was certainly encouraged in some ways by the Trump administration, but it's not new. I just think it's kind of emerged here. No, I would have never guessed this. I would have thought if you're told, look, 750,000 people have died from this virus. I know people who have died. Everybody knows people who've been at least infected. This is not a theoretical problem. There's a few thousand cases of chicken pox that circulate. Most people don't know people who are currently infected with chicken, but this one, still people choose not to get a vaccine. No, I would have never believed this. I got it all wrong.
Yeah. Okay, let's do the kids first. So talk about myocarditis, talk about the risks and benefits of a vaccine if you had a 7-year-old.
Well, I would definitely get a vaccine. The vaccine for the 5 to 11-year-old now has just launched. Here's what I would say. The question is never when do you know everything, it's when do you know enough. So what do you know? Here's what you know about the 5 to 11-year-old. You know that 1.9 million 5 to 11-year-olds have been infected with this virus. You know that 8,300 have been hospitalized. You know that a third of those who've been hospitalized have been in the intensive care unit. You know that a third of those who've been hospitalized had no previous comorbidities, were perfectly normal before that, nothing to put them at risk of serious disease. You know that more than 100 children in that age group have died from this virus. You know that. You know that a 2,400 child, roughly 2,400 child study was done, 2-to-1 vaccine to placebo, 1,600 vaccine, 800 placebo, that there were 19 cases of COVID-19 in that study, 16 in the placebo group, for a vaccine efficacy of 91%. And you know that you have now really the same or better efficacy really in the 12 to 15-year-old from a similarly sized study where there were 18 cases of COVID all in the placebo group. And you have hundreds of millions of people who were adults who've gotten this vaccine. This is just I mean, I was fortunate enough to be part of a team at Children's Hospital Philadelphia that created the rotavirus vaccine. You know, pediatric vaccines don't have the experience of hundreds of millions of adults getting the vaccine before that, or adolescents or older adolescents. You don't have that. So you have that here. So that's good. So I think you can feel comfortable the vaccine works and that there's a need for it. So then the question is it safe? What everybody's worried about with the mRNA vaccines is myocarditis. And certainly myocarditis as a young child is going to upset us more than myocarditis, say, in an adult. Now, the good news about myocarditis generally is a short-lived, transient, self-resolving phenomenon, but I'm sure over time we will define a spectrum of illness with that disorder. We know that upsettingly, that this was primarily a problem of the young man. I mean, it's dose 2 within 4 or 5 days of the dose, and primarily the 6 to 25-year-old. And the 16 to 17-year-old, it was roughly 1 per 5,000. Totally in that age group I just mentioned, 16, say, to 29, is about 1 per 20,000. But that's, you know, and although rare, it was real. So now what happens when you drop down to the 12 to 15-year-old group? Because now we have a lot of data on that group. And the good news is that both in US and Israel, it's actually a lesser risk in that group than the 1 in 20,000 we were seeing in that 16 to 29-year-old. The other thing that's somewhat encouraging is that the dose is lower. So this is a 10, not 30 microgram dose for the 5 to 11-year-old. So that's comforting. So I think, you know, although myocarditis may well be a consequence, a rare consequence in that age group, I still think you have to believe the benefits outweigh the risk. Remember, SARS-CoV-2 also causes, COVID also is associated with myocarditis. And MIS-C is commonly associated with myocarditis. Commonly, like, you know, 50 to 75% of the time. So I do think that there is no avoiding it. I do think that the other reason, by the way, for kids is, you know, remember, we still vaccinate children in this country with polio every year. With polio vaccine. We do it because, not because we have polio in this country. We haven't had a case of polio in this country since the 1970s. We've been pretty much 50 years polio free, but polio still exists in the world. It still exists in Afghanistan, it still exists in Pakistan. And so that's why we do that. So the question then becomes, for how long are we going to need to have a immune population? I think for a long time, and children grow up. So I think that's another reason to vaccinate kids.
Okay. This is a kid, both an adult question, which is the issue. You made the point that if you've had prior infection, you have a terrific response to the vaccine. Why not just give the kids a single dose and not 2?
Yeah, you know, I wish there certainly are now a fair amount of convincing data that in adults, that if you've been naturally infected and you get a single dose of an mRNA-containing vaccine, that you have a response that is just as like your second dose. In other words, you get not surprisingly, a booster response. So why not have that as a recommendation? I think if it's any consolation, I have said that directly to our CDC director. So I really do think we should have that as a recommendation. And similarly, if we generate similar studies in children, we should have that for them too. I agree. It would make sense. I would like to see the studies done in children first. But
yeah, I mean, the logistics get tricky in terms of, do you have to test everybody for antibodies and then think about test characteristics?
That's not. Remember, 40% of children between 5 and 11 years of age have already been infected. The seroprevalence says 42% was presented by the CDC.
From your standpoint, it is not an irrational idea to go ahead and get a single vaccine if you've had documented prior infection.
Well, again, I'd like to see the studies in children first. We certainly have it in adults. Yeah, I think in adults it's perfectly rational. It would be nice if you had a recommendation for that.
All righty, let's talk about boosters for a second. Are you in favor of them? Who do you think should and shouldn't get them? And if you'd gotten prior Pfizer, would you get another Pfizer or would you get a Moderna?
Well, so the question is, what's the goal for the vaccine? If the goal for the vaccine is protection against serious illness, for the most part, the studies support that, and the immunology supports that. I have no idea what that noise is. I think we're being invaded by locusts.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. It's just one of many plagues. I think that would make sense. I'm sorry, the boosters, right? So so if the goal is to protect against serious illness, it looks like 2 doses of an mRNA-containing vaccine, if we use that as an example, is still protective against serious disease. Um, but what certainly does fade, neutralizing antibodies fade. And with that, you get a fading of protection against asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infection. So if you're trying to keep neutralizing antibodies up, then a booster makes sense. But remember, it will fade, after whatever, 6 months or a year, you'll eventually start to see neutralizing antibodies come down. I mean, many countries now give boosters. If you try and answer the question, where's the clear evidence that a booster matters? The publication out of the Israeli, by the Israeli group, I think showed that for the 70 to 79-year-old especially, there clearly was statistically significant evidence that a booster mattered in that older group. But I think once President Biden stood up and said on August 18th, starting on September 20th, we're going to have, booster dosing available for everybody over 16. I think a door got open that was never going to close and just got wider and wider and wider. That now, frankly, if you look at all the indications, includes about 85% of the American public. I think inadvertently, when President Biden did that, he sent the message that 2 doses was not protective.
Yeah.
And so we've created this kind of booster mania. I think Dr. Walensky had a great line recently on TV when she said, we're not going to boost our way out of this pandemic. Right. We need to vaccinate people who are unvaccinated if you really want to get on top of this pandemic.
Yeah. I guess I've always wondered when people say, what is the goal? I sort of think I still don't want to get COVID if I can avoid it. And if my immunity, even to a mild case, has waned, and there's some probability of long COVID, in a breakthrough case, why not? So I've never quite understood the argument against boosters in, let's say, a 60-year-old who got their 2 shots 7 or 8 months ago.
Yeah, so the question is, how common is long COVID then in somebody who's been vaccinated? I mean, there's some data say out of Israel that it was based on a very small study, like 7 people meant it was like 19% or something. But if that's the goal, if the goal is to try and prevent mild or asymptomatic infection, I just think that we're going to have to gear up for the fact that we're going to be getting vaccinated in the same manner that we get vaccinated against flu, which is yearly. But hopefully I'm wrong. I mean, we'll see. I guess I'm having grown up in the world of trying to prevent a mucosal infection like rotavirus. I mean, if the goal for our vaccine or for the pertussis vaccine or the flu vaccine is to try and prevent asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic infection, that is a high goal. I think we should have never used the word breakthrough, frankly, to describe a mild or asymptomatic infection. That's not a breakthrough. I think a breakthrough is when you're vaccinated and still are hospitalized. That's a breakthrough. I mean, I think Lindsey Graham got this right, because you often don't get the Republicans on science or medicine, but Lindsey Graham got it right when he said, after being vaccinated, he had a respiratory infection which included sinusitis. He said, quote, "This would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated." Right, that's right. So, and Brett Kavanaugh had an asymptomatic infection associated with having been vaccinated. And the way the media carries it, with the breakthrough, you think he was in the ICU. That's what vaccines do. Most pediatric residents don't see rotavirus anymore because we've been able to prevent serious illness, but rotavirus still circulates. It's just generally asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic. That's the goal of pretty much every vaccine, to keep you out of the doctor's office and out of the hospital.
Got it. Fair number of questions about sort of specifics of boosters. So if you got J&J, what would you be doing? If you did decide you wanted a booster, you met one of these eligibility criteria and you'd previously gotten Moderna, what would you get? And if you'd previously gotten Pfizer, what would you get?
Right. Well, the J&J question is one that comes up to the most for me. So if you've gotten J&J's vaccine, there were data that were generated here by Kristen Light and coworkers at the University of Maryland under an NIH grant, that if you get an mRNA vaccine, either Moderna or Pfizer, that you get a level of neutralizing antibodies that is greater than if you got a second dose of J&J vaccine. That said, J&J's, I think, vaccine was always a 2-dose vaccine. I mean, when the FDA committee, considered that vaccine at the end of February, they were in the midst of doing a 2-dose trial because they had already shown that a second dose given 2 months later clearly boosted neutralizing antibodies. And so they were almost done, their second dose. I think were this not a pandemic, this would have always been a 2-dose vaccine. So they did a 30,000 person trial where they showed that 2 doses gave you 94% protection. So when people say to me, well, look at that Moderna and Pfizer where you get like a better boost. Well, the fact is a 30,000 person trial showed you that it worked really well. To me, that's the proof in the pudding. I mean, the neutralizing antibodies are only supposed to predict how it's going to do. Here was a study that showed you how well it did. So I think a second dose of J&J is fine. I think what came from all those studies, crystalline light studies, and it was 9, different combinations, all 9 combinations. I think that the take-home line was everything works as a booster, and I think just for convenience sake, the country basically just said, you can boost with anything because just because if you walk into a place, you've gotten 2 doses of Pfizer and they only have Moderna's, you can get Moderna's or whatever. So everything seemed to work.
Let me bring on George Rutherford, see if George has any questions for you. While he's coming on, let me ask you my last, which is you talked about sort of the immunity from natural, and maybe this for both of you, immunity from natural infection. It strikes me that we're in this sort of funny zone now where if you're San Francisco and 80% of people are vaccinated, you're really well protected because of that vaccine rate. Relatively few people have gotten infected here because people have been good with, the vaccine use is also correlated with the mask use and everything else. If you're in other places in the country, the vaccine rate is incredibly low, but you probably have a whole lot of natural infection for the same reason. And those two, and maybe you're at the same level of, quote, overall immunity, but they're going to wane at different rates. And in a place like the Bay Area, people will get boosted. And in a place where there were relatively few vaccines, people are unlikely to get vaccinated. So how do you see that playing out in terms of sort of the progression of sort of the waning of immunity in both of those cohorts over time?
I'll start and then turn it over to George. I mean, there does seem to be a clear correlation between the percentage of people in a population that are vaccinated and the spread of disease. I mean, if you look at say the Southeast, which tend to be less vaccinated, Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, that they tend to have more transmission than say the Northeast. That may not have to do with that. It may have to do just with different climates and how this Delta variant is spreading across the country. I guess we'll learn. I am of the belief that both natural infection and vaccination can protect against serious illness. When the virus rolled in, last January, that was the question. Are people who are naturally infected going to be protected when re-exposed? Because if they weren't, then you were going to have a hard time making the vaccine, right? I mean, group A strep infections or gonorrhea, I mean, those are diseases where natural infection doesn't seem to protect, which is why we don't have vaccines against those. So that was very reassuring, at least for vaccinologists. But so I do think natural infection, I think both protect. And I think you have conflicting studies. Israel says it's better to be a natural infection. There's just a recent study here showing much better to be vaccinated. So I turn it over to George.
George, any comment on that?
You captured it all. It's a bit up in the air. I mean, I do agree with you about a single dose after natural infection. That seems to me to be more than adequate, and be chasing people down to get a second dose after they've already had natural infection seems to be sort of an unnecessary exercise. But I got my my Moderna booster today, Bob. So
after you got Moderna originally, or
after I got Moderna originally, I'm not. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me to just stick with the horse,
Yeah,
I haven't gotten a booster yet. I just like you to know.
You've not. I'm really
categories for getting a booster.
But you're eligible, I assume, as a healthcare worker.
I'm over 65, a healthcare
You're
worker.
over 65, and
I have fallen into 3 categories. I still haven't got my booster. I will because I recommended it for the FDA. It would be hypocritical if I didn't get it, so I'll get it.
And you haven't every time I see you, you're in your house. So is that just because you never leave the house? Is that
never get out of this chair?
Never leave that chair. Before we turn it over to George, do you have any questions for Paul?
No, it was great. It was terrific. I'm sorry I had to come in late. I was doing another symposium for the state.
No problem. All right, Paul, thank you. We will, let me just check my list of questions here. Why doesn't VAERS, one of our listeners asked, why doesn't VAERS have a filter? It seems kind of crazy.
I think, honestly, I think we would be better off not to have VAERS. VAERS has worked in a couple instances. It did pick up intussusception as a rare consequence of the RotaShield vaccine back in the late 1990s, and it actually picked up myocarditis early. So I think it is at best a hypothesis generating mechanism, but it is so misused because people assume that that all these vaccine adverse events are really associated with the vaccine. That the anti-vaccine people love VAERS. It's their favorite system.
Yeah. Last question for you. Somebody asked about the spacing of the PEDS doses. Do you think we're giving them too close to each other?
It's the way the studies were done. I think, time will tell. See, the thinking, if you ask Dr. Fauci, why the 3rd dose? He will say this should have always been a 3-dose vaccine, the mRNA vaccines. And the reason he said if this wasn't a pandemic, this would have been a 3-dose vaccine, because he makes the analogy to the inactivated polio vaccine. Because with inactivated viral vaccines, if you're going to get decent memory responses, you really do need a 4 to 6 month window between doses. That's why you do it that way. But I'm not sure the mRNA vaccines are that. I mean, I'm not sure they're directly analogous to the inactivated vaccines, because you do synthesize viral proteins in your cell And you could make the argument that's more similar in some ways to the live attenuated viral vaccines. We're going to learn as we go.
Great. Paul, thank you as always. Always learn a ton from you and appreciate all the hard work. And I know you're in the middle of a lot of controversy, so it's great to be out there speaking for science. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Let's turn it over to George. George, I'm not even going to introduce you. Everybody knows who you are. So why don't you go ahead and just get right into it.
You recognize me in the grocery store, Bob.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay. So this is not a particularly great news session. I mean, there is some good news and some bad news. And the bad news is that cases are going up again in California. These are presumably all Delta variant, although the data haven't quite caught up yet. But we've had a 26% increase in cases over the last 14 days and a 6% increase in hospitalizations. The U.S. is plateauing here. We're leveling off at around, the modest amount of 70,000 cases a day. I mean, it sounds so crazy, right? Overall, we have 58% of everyone immunized and vaccinated in the United States and 61% in California. So this is something to really pay close attention to as we enter the colder months. And this is an example of what colder months are. These are cases by county in the United States, and even in highly vaccinated places like New Hampshire and Vermont, you can see how these sort of northernmost tiers of counties are starting to develop outbreaks and more transmission, as is Alaska, not surprisingly. Again, the biggest concentration is in the Intermountain West and the Great Plains, and it's starting to spread more from the down here down towards Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and not just sit up here in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho and North Dakota. So something to be cognizant of. And if you look at Colorado and New Mexico and Minnesota, which all show up on the top 10, remember California is at 62%. These guys are right at the same level that we are. So, it's a cautionary tale, and you can't just rack this up to being, Wyoming only has 44% of people vaccinated, and that's why. I mean, that's part of it, but there are other places that give you a different tale. Here in California, we do have we've had some decline in test positivity. It's down, it's not 2.8, it's now 2.2% positive, which is a good thing. The effective reproductive number is up now again, flirting with 1, it's at 0.93. And as I said earlier, hospitalizations have increased by 6%. If you look at per capita, it's the foothill counties, it's the Eastern Slope and Inyo, it's the Sacramento Valley, and it's the Central Valley that really stand out. Luckily, large parts of urban Southern California, where most of the population is, or 2/3 of the population is, of the state, are doing well, but San Bernardino, Riverside, and even San Diego have fairly high levels of cases. And rather than look by per capita, I put it over here in actual cases. But look at Los Angeles has gone up by 25%, San Diego by 10, Riverside and San Bernardino, which were never that particularly under control, have gone up by 30%. And then interestingly for our UCSF folks, Fresno is up by 22% as well. So these are all really troubling things because these are the places with the most cases. And there's far off of that CDC cut point of around 7 cases per 100,000 per day, which is the equivalent of 50 cases per 100,000 per week, more or less. Okay, and it's really down here at Orange and Santa Clara that you even get down into single digits. If you look at the Bay Area, this is the thing: it's down, up, down, down, up, nothing, up, down, nothing. Right, so you can get this impression that we really are kind of teetering right at the edge. And here you can see what proportion of people are vaccinated. This is probably the strongest performance in the nation. Solano County has always lagged behind, and Napa and Sonoma are somewhere in between Solano and then the larger urban counties. The percent positivity, you can see here in Sonoma, which is probably having an outbreak right now, is 2.8%. with an R sub E of 1.04. But if you look down about who's above and below the magic 50 per 100,000 per day, you get an idea of where we're sitting. It's a pretty mixed bag right now. So what factors are associated with incident cases of vaccine preventable diseases? Well, first and foremost, it's that people don't get vaccinated. You can't prevent vaccine preventable diseases without getting vaccinated. And then the second distant reason is vaccine failure. These mRNA vaccines have have cold chain requirements. And so there's always the question of always possibility for mishandling. You can have immunocompromise from infection or from inborn errors. You can have it because of therapeutics. You can have genetic drift because of variants, which is what we worry about with influenza all the time. Delta, while it's much more transmissible, it is susceptible to the current vaccines. And then finally, as Dr. Offit discussed, we have this question of waning immunity and decreasing neutralizing antibody. Again, it depends on what you're trying to do, but that is a real phenomenon. So what do we need to do? So we need to vaccinate the unvaccinated, including those who've had earlier documented infection, although as you heard from the prior comments, we're not big believers in having to have 2 vaccines, but I think, one will do the trick, and that's how they do it in Europe. We need to vaccinate the newly eligible, the 5 to 11-year-olds, and we need to get people boosters who need them, especially people who are 65 years old and people with immunocompromise. Okay, so how well are we doing? We've given 53 million doses in California. You can see there's been a big uptick here as people are starting to get serious about getting vaccinated again. These are probably represent boosters to some extent. This is not kids yet. And I'm a pediatrician, so kids is a technical term, elementary school age children. We've vaccinated 2.57. We've given 2.57 million booster doses out, but the California population over 65 is 5.7 million. So we're less than halfway there, which is a big problem and needs to be addressed. There's a balance between waning immunity and getting people boosted. That's this race that's going to keep this tamped down. Across the Bay Area, you can see how well we're doing with full vaccination. And as we start to vaccinate 5 to 11-year-olds, we'll see these counties start to move into the 80+% vaccinated range. Now, I was asked last time I spoke a lot about what's going on in the United Kingdom. So this is what's going on. So this would have been us. We would have had this sort of drop off. They have stayed up and have had continued transmission. This is all Delta. This is in the face of having 68% of the population fully vaccinated. However, the other thing is that there's a new subvariant of Delta called AY.4.2 that accounts for about 7% of UK isolates, but it's not necessarily been linked to the surge. What's been linked to the surge is that all legal restrictions, all the non-pharmaceutical interventions were lifted, especially in England as opposed to Scotland, on July 19th. This is a consequence of failure to vaccinate, and the population that they failed to vaccinate are young adolescents. And this is the 12 to 15-year-olds are driving this epidemic, 10 to 14-year-olds. And here you can see in Britain, these are rates over a 6-week period from early September to October. 5 to 9-year-olds, 10 to 14-year-olds, 15 to 19-year-olds, and then all the other populations out here. This is being driven by younger adolescents largely, and they've just started a new campaign to vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds, and only 21% of them are currently fully vaccinated. Now, the day I put this slide together on Monday, this headline showed up in the Los Angeles Times: unvaccinated teens driving infection rates in Los Angeles. This just to show you what the vaccine coverage is in Los Angeles among 12 to 17-year-olds. These are data from this morning: 64% fully vaccinated, 9% partially vaccinated, whereas in San Francisco, it's 80% and 7%. So we're lacking 13%, and Los Angeles is lacking 28%. That's a big difference, and this is enough to sustain transmission. And I think statewide, a lot of the increases we're seeing are being driven numerically by cases in Los Angeles, which are seem to be disproportionately falling into this age category. Now, there are three things I'm going to show you that I think three new pieces of data. Then I apologize if Dr. Offit showed them already. This is looking at the question of what if you've had disease before? Will you do better? Which vaccine does better? And if you've been unvaccinated with a previous, this is a case control study that CDC did in 9 states. So if you just look here, well, let's look up here. So you're fully vaccinated without a previously documented infection, okay? Unvaccinated with a previous SARS-CoV-2 infection. So these are people who have not been revaccinated after infection. They had 6.11 times higher odds of being hospitalized with laboratory confirmed COVID. These are people 18 and over. During the Delta predominant period, it was 7.55. For those of you who received Pfizer BioNTech, to start with, it was 5.11 times higher odds. For Moderna, it's 7.3 times higher odds. And for older people, 65 and older, it's almost 20-fold higher odds. That's the risk. Those are the odds that are associated with smoking and lung cancer. Okay, so this is a big, big deal, right? So these are data that says if you've been previously infected, you should still get vaccinated. A second line of data comes from Israel. Dr. Offit mentioned this, but let me just show you the data. This is comparing people who got 2 doses versus 3 doses of Pfizer BioNTech. And this is all comers. These aren't just older people. The median age in these studies was 58. So the vaccine effectiveness for a 3rd dose compared to 2 doses is 93% for infection, 95% for hospitalization, and 80% for death compared to 2 doses. So that's, I think, pretty compelling data. Those are pretty compelling data to suggest vaccine boosting is important for both hospitalizations and mortality. Now, the third thing is that the National Intelligence Council weighed in on where the virus came from. And I thought this was a really interesting thing and something you might not be popping up on your reader. So I thought I should put it up here. So this is from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We judged the virus was not developed as a biological weapon. Most agencies also assessed with low confidence that SARS-CoV-2 probably was not genetically engineered. China's officials did not have foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak of COVID-19 emerged. And then 4 of the 6 elements, I couldn't name them, but that's the denominator, believe that it was most likely caused by natural exposure to an animal infected with it or a close progenitor virus. A couple of others said they couldn't rule out a laboratory accident. So that's the latest from the intelligence community. And then finally, I'll just end on saying that we're at the Institute for Global Health Sciences, we're helping with a campaign to raise funding for COVAX, where it's if you get your booster shot, I got to do this later today, that you're asked to contribute $7 a dose. And this goes to the COVAX, which is the UN, WHO, Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations spinoff to provide COVID vaccines for the developing world. And here's the QR code and the URL. And this is also up on the Institute for Global Health Sciences website. So there, I'll stop there after that political announcement, and which I hope you knew was coming, Bob. I thought I told somebody.
I saw a version of it last week, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, George. We only have a couple minutes for questions. So one question came in, given our move into the endemic phase, if that's what's happening, should we stop looking at cases and just look at hospitalizations? And let me broaden that question to, as we move to what might be a new normal of no big surges, if we have 80% of the people vaccinated, but COVID in our life, how do you think that changes what the public health response should be, what we should be doing as individuals?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, I'm not at all convinced we're not going to have another surge this winter. There are some warning signs in some directions and some favorable signs in other directions. But I don't know that we're able to just laugh this one off and say this has now become sort of part of the new normal, and we just vaccinate people and hope for the best. That's clearly not worked in Britain, and I think we need to be cognizant of that. I don't think we can really rest on our laurels. I mean, first of all, I think as a nation, well, as a state and region, we should be out of this by spring. We'll know here in November will be the tail of the tape. We'll understand what's going to happen, whether we'll have a surge or not in November. If we get out on the other side of it and have high levels of people vaccinated, a lot of vaccine coverage, then I think we might be able to really kind of throw masks away, return to normal, do all those sorts of things. If not, then we need to, we're going to have to string this out longer. And part of it's going to depend on getting lots of people vaccinated around the world. So we're not going to have new variants, although, you could say that the Delta has outcompeted all the other variants that have popped up and it's gone head to head with. So we may be looking at the worst there is.
Yeah.
That
We're a
may
little
also
over
be
in time, but I
mostly
want to take an extra minute or two. I guess when you say spring and maybe throw the masks away,
maybe
you just showed us that the vaccine efficacy wanes, and at least in Israel they did better with boosters. So what's the dynamic that will say that we reach a point where the minute you feel good about things, you stop being careful and your efficacy wanes and you're setting yourself up for another hit?
Well, the point is that if it's not circulating, it's not circulating, right? We get vaccination rates so high that we actually truly do get herd immunity.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to jump on an airplane and fly to Romania, to learn folk dancing tomorrow without a mask on, but they have a big surge right now. But it's not inconceivable that the Bay Area, could walk away, and urban Southern California could really walk away with high levels of vaccination, especially if we can get it into these younger kids. That will really create something that looks like herd immunity.
Okay. And then when you see these surges in places with reasonably high vaccine rates, you mentioned Colorado and other places. So what's your take home from that? It's just not high enough?
Well, there's reasonably high and there's high.
Yeah.
Right. And those are 62%. So I'd say those are reasonably high, but they're not all the way. And they're large. And the whole construct of herd immunity is about random distribution in a population, which is how the British have been burned, because they have all these unvaccinated kids and young adolescents that are sustaining transmission. So you're going to have to get it to a point where the people who are susceptible are really pretty randomly distributed in the population in order to reap the benefit of herd immunity.
And a lot of experts have been saying recently, don't hold out for herd immunity. It's not coming. Even if you get to 90%, it's going to wane, and people aren't going to all get boosters on the right day and all that kind of stuff. But it's not, you're using that term reasonably freely here. So
I'm pretty. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can always throw water all over everything, but I think it's going to get us a lot closer. I mean, I don't see us being able to sustain this as a society for years and years and years and years to prevent handfuls of cases. I mean, we're going to rely on vaccination.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll take that as a mixed bag of news. Where it does look like that plateauing in California and maybe upticks, or that part's a little disheartening, particularly if the weather gets colder and things get worse. But we just have to keep at it in terms of vaccinations and boosters, it sounds like. Someone asked about the donation link. Can you put that in the chat again if you have it? Or I don't know if Alyssa can do that. And let's go ahead and switch slides as well to CME for those that want CME. Thanks, George. I really appreciate it.